It was a late night, and after a long day, I just wanted to get home. The city was quieter than usual, the streets nearly empty. As I walked, I noticed a thick fog beginning to roll in, creeping between the buildings and swallowing up the familiar landmarks around me. At first, I didn't think much of it. London is known for its foggy nights. But this felt different, heavier, almost alive. The fog seemed to have a mind of its own, quickly enveloping everything in sight. Streetlights that should have been visible from a distance were now just faint glows in the mist. My footsteps echoed in the eerie silence, each one sounding more hollow than the last. I quickened my pace, but the fog kept pace with me, thickening until I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead. There was something about the silence that unnerved me. The usual hum of the city was gone, replaced by an unsettling stillness. And then, just as I started to wonder if I was the only person left in the world, I heard it. A faint whisper, so soft I wasn't sure if it was real or just my imagination. It seemed to come from all around me, carried on the thick, suffocating fog. I strained to hear, but the words were just out of reach, like a conversation happening in another room. My heart raced as the fog seemed to close in tighter, the whispers growing louder. I was no longer sure of where I was or where I was going. The streets I knew so well had disappeared, replaced by an unfamiliar maze of shadows and mist. Finally, I saw a break in the fog up ahead and hurried toward it, desperate to escape whatever was lurking within. As I emerged, I found myself standing in a part of the city I didn't recognize. The buildings were different, older, and the streets were deserted. I glanced around, trying to get my bearings, but nothing looked familiar. I had no memory of how I'd gotten there. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. It was as if the city itself had gone to sleep, leaving me alone in some forgotten corner. I pulled out my phone, hoping to use GPS to find my way back, but the battery was dead, even though it had been fully charged just moments before. I turned around to retrace my steps, but the fog had swallowed the path behind me, leaving me with no choice but to keep moving forward into the unknown. My only option was to walk until I found something, anything, that would lead me home. But as I continued, I couldn't shake the feeling that the fog wasn't done with me yet, that it had more to show me before it would let me go. One night, after a late shift, I found myself walking home through the quiet, deserted streets. The air was cool, and the only sound was the steady rhythm of my footsteps echoing through the stillness. I was eager to get home, so I kept my head down, lost in thought, when I noticed something unusual, a figure in the distance, walking in the same direction as me. At first, I didn't think much of it. It was late, and people were always out at odd hours in the city. But as I continued, I couldn't help but notice that the figure seemed to match my every move. When I sped up, they sped up. When I slowed down, they did too. The figure never got closer, yet never fell behind, always maintaining the same unnerving distance. I started to feel a creeping unease. My mind raced with possibilities. Was this person following me? Was it just a coincidence? I tried to shake off the feeling of paranoia, convincing myself that it was just my imagination playing tricks on me in the dark. But the longer it went on, the more certain I became that this wasn't just a coincidence. I decided to test it. I abruptly crossed the street, walking faster now, my pulse quickening. To my growing horror, the figure mirrored my actions exactly, crossing the street and matching my pace with an eerie precision. The streetlights seemed to cast long, distorted shadows, making everything feel more surreal and menacing. I kept glancing back, trying to get a better look at the figure, but it remained just far enough away that I couldn't make out any details. Only the unsettling certainty that they were still there, still following. My heart was pounding in my chest as I turned onto my street, almost running now. I reached my door, fumbling with my keys in the dark, my hands trembling. Before I went inside, I dared to look back one last time, expecting to see the figure standing at the corner. But they were gone. The street was empty, as if they had never been there. A wave of relief washed over me, but it was short-lived. Despite the figure's sudden disappearance, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was still being watched, still being followed by something unseen. Even after I locked the door behind me and checked all the windows, the uneasy sensation lingered. That night, I barely slept, convinced that the silent pursuer was still out there, somewhere in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to appear again. One night, after a long day, I decided to take a shortcut home through an alley I usually avoided. It was dark, the kind of dark that swallows the light whole, but I was tired and wanted to get home quickly. As I walked, I felt a strange unease settle over me, but I brushed it off as nerves from being alone in such a shadowy place. As I continued, I noticed something out of the corner of my eye, a shadow that seemed to move. I told myself it was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I walked further, the shadow seemed to grow, taking on a more defined shape. It wasn't just a trick of the light anymore, it was something else entirely. I quickened my pace, hoping to shake off the uneasiness, but the shadow kept pace with me, growing larger and more distinct with every step. My heart began to race as the realization hit me. This shadow wasn't behaving like any normal shadow. It seemed to have a life of its own, moving with purpose, as if it was following me. By the time I reached the end of the alley, I was nearly running, desperate to escape whatever was lurking behind me. But just as I was about to step into the relative safety of the streetlights ahead, the shadow moved ahead of me, blocking my path. I froze, staring at it in disbelief. There was nothing to cast the shadow. No person, no object, just an empty, menacing darkness. It was as if the shadow itself had stepped out of the walls and taken form, and it stood there, silent and still, yet full of an unspeakable threat. Panic surged through me. I tried to move, to scream, to do anything, but I was paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. This wasn't just a shadow. It was something else. Something that shouldn't exist. And it was right in front of me. After what felt like an eternity, I forced myself to take a step back, then another. The shadow didn't move, but I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing down on me with an almost physical weight. I turned and bolted, not daring to look back until I was safely out of the alley. When I finally stopped to catch my breath, the shadow was gone. The alley looked normal, just as dark and empty as it had been before, but I knew what I had seen. That shadow wasn't just a trick of the light, it was something far more sinister. I never took that shortcut again. Even now, I can't walk down a dark alley without thinking about that night, wondering if the shadow is still there, waiting for someone else to cross its path. After a fun night out with friends, I found myself walking home alone. The streets were deserted, and the usual city noise had faded into a still silence. All I could hear was the echo of my own footsteps, rhythmic and steady against the pavement. As I walked, the quiet began to feel unnerving. That's when I heard it. Another set of footsteps. They were faint at first, almost blending in with the sound of my own, but unmistakably there. I slowed my pace slightly, and to my horror, the other footsteps slowed too. I quickened my step, and they quickened in response. Whoever, or whatever, was following me was matching my pace exactly. My heart started to race, and I felt a knot of fear tightening in my stomach. I glanced over my shoulder, but the street behind me was empty. No movement, no shadow, just the same deserted road I had been walking down. But the footsteps didn't stop. They grew louder, more pronounced, as if whoever was following me was getting closer. Panic took over, and I began to walk faster, nearly breaking into a run. The footsteps behind me sped up as well, keeping perfect time with mine. I could feel my breath quicken as I tried to rationalize what was happening. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was someone nearby I couldn't see. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. The sound was too clear, too real. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I stopped dead in my tracks and spun around, expecting to come face to face with my pursuer. But there was nothing. No one. The street was as empty as it had been before. The only sound now was the pounding of my own heartbeat. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, trying to catch my breath and make sense of the situation. But then, just as I was beginning to convince myself that it was all in my head, I felt it. A cold breath on the back of my neck, so chilling that it sent shivers down my spine. The kind of breath that was unmistakably close, too close for comfort. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but stand there, frozen in terror. And then, just as suddenly as it had come, the presence behind me vanished. The footsteps stopped, and the air around me returned to its normal temperature. I didn't wait to find out if it would come back. I ran the rest of the way home, not daring to look back, the fear lingering long after I had locked my door behind me. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened that night. But every time I walk home alone, I can't help but listen for the sound of those following footsteps, hoping I'll never hear them again.